John Huston was at Warner Brothers, where you make all those low budget crime films. And then he had signed with MGM for a two film deal. It was going to be more if the films were financially successful, but they were only critically successful. This was the first of the two. And it was a situation where normally writers, directors have to, yield to the producer's whims of like, all right, I want it this way, that way. But it's interesting because it starts off saying it's a John Huston production, and the producer actually was, they were in perfect synchronicity with what they wanted to accomplish. So this was a point where maybe he didn't have the power to say I have final cut, but because him and the producer were on the same page, it's a situation where they kind of did have final cut. He did have final cut in a way, and it's a typical, you know, A-level effort from John Huston. A lot of his films deal with completing some kind of mission or some kind of quest, and in completion of that, these characters that you're following end up evolving, or they end up it ends up being a more of like a self them finding themselves rather than them actually accomplishing the mission. One of my favorite Houston films is The Treasure Sierra Madre, which I think exemplifies what he tries to do in all of his films. That's kind of like the peak of what a lot of his films try to accomplish. And then another one of my favorites is The Maltese Falcon, which I previously reviewed on my channel. But this is right up there. Not as good maybe as those two, but close.
Yeah, those two, the Maltese Falcon and Treasure of Sierra Madre, those are two of my childhood movies, movies my dad showed me on TV. And I just love them. And, I think they're amazing. I think they're basically perfect movies. I can watch them anytime. The Asphalt Jungle, I don't know as well. I'm sure I saw it many, many years ago, but I could only remember vague things about it. I couldn't really remember any details. So that's one reason why I was looking forward to seeing it again now, because I really feel like I should know it better. And it is a good movie, but I'm not sure if I like it quite as much as those other two.
Yeah. Yeah, this is interesting. I kind of had that same feeling as well. I'm like, I must have seen this movie before. And I went into it thinking, all right, this is like my second time seeing it. But as I'm watching, I'm like, I don't remember a single thing I'm watching on screen. Did I really see this movie before? You know?
Yeah,
But in a
yeah.
way, I've seen this movie dozens, maybe 100 times. Why? Because it follows the same plot structure of all of these caper slash heist movies. It's the same
Hmm.
thing. All right, here are these characters, they have their flaws, they're down and out. Okay, here's this situation where, listen, I got this plan, but I need a team. And then the team comes together, and then each of these team members are kind of flawed, and they're going to be self-destructive. They pull off the heist or the caper, something goes wrong, people start getting hurt or killed or snitching or backstabbing, and it just follows the same formula. And even at the time when this came out, I'm sure it was very formulaic, but this came out in 1950, so you're talking about almost 75 years ago, and it's still that same formula. Whether you're watching a movie like Inception, or Across 110th Street, or Heat, or you just name your favorite movie that involves some kind of a heist, you're going to find the similar beats, whether it's from the 70s, like Across 110th Street and it's blaxploitation, or it's a big budget Christopher Nolan Inception, or whatever film you want to think of, or Heat, which inspired The Dark Knight, and countless films that follow this formula. And I think this does a good job of not just, following the formula, but also expounding on it and making you care about the characters, which is, I think, the most important part of a film like this. If you don't care about these characters, then you're really just, you're not going to be as invested in, like, when things start going wrong, oh my God, like that tension is, you wish that things are going to go right, but because of their flaws that they're doomed, just because they're not capable of getting out of their own way.
Yeah, I think this movie must have been fairly influential because as I was watching it, I sort of had that feeling of Oh yeah, I've seen this before, like particularly the heist stuff, where it's like, oh yeah, this is like every movie I've seen since then, where there's been a heist with all the complicated things that need to be done. And of course, I also couldn't help but think of something I mentioned once before, which is an SCTV sketch called Maudlin's 11, which is actually a direct spoof of Ocean's 11. But it's very much a heist story, and very similar in the sense that there's all these people involved and they've got to do different things. And anyway, I just couldn't help but think of it. But I feel like this must have been pretty fresh in a way when it came out. And I know that the Hayes office, the Hayes Code, they did not like the fact that it really showed the heist in detail, because it's kind of like teaching people how to do this, how to, break in somewhere. And so I know that was one of the things that kind of got them in a little bit of trouble, although they got away with it in the end. They showed it pretty much in detail. But the fact that they were in trouble for it tells me that there hadn't really been much before that was like this in terms of showing that realistic detail. So yeah, I think it's probably very influential.
Yeah, I don't know if it invented these tropes or pioneered these tropes, but I think it was definitely one of the more successful films that had these tropes in them. And whether it was cliched or not at the time, who knows? Maybe it was incredibly innovative. Maybe it was or it wasn't. But the point is, whatever it was, 75 years later, they're still doing the same formula. So even if you prefer any of those other films I mentioned or the Ocean's 11 films that you mentioned, more than this, you also have to take into consideration this movie was made several decades before those movies. And even if they're kind of comparable, that should tell you how good this movie is, that it would even be comparable as to movies made decades later that had a chance to study, perfect, retool that formula. And still, this movie is kind of on that level. So I think while myself and you, we don't maybe view it as highly as the Maltese Falcon and Treasure of Sierra Madre, which is no knock. Those are two of the greatest films ever made. I think part of the knock is that we can't say for sure how innovative this film is. And sometimes being the first can also be a knock on you, because then other people can then just try to do it better, you know? So sometimes if your biggest attribute is you're the first to do it, it doesn't really stand the test of time as if you were be the more creative person. Even if you weren't the first one to do it, you executed it like, more creatively. So I think that's the only thing this film lacks. I mean, I think it's like a 9 out of 10. I think the thing that maybe has the Maltese Falcon and Treasure Sierra Madre above those is there isn't as much creativity in as far as like the shot composition or certain execution aspects of it. I don't view it as highly artistic. I view it as incredibly well written, which is a given because John Huston's a great writer and that's his background. So it's going to be incredibly well written. The characters are well directed because John Huston's a great director. He's also an actor, so he knows how to work with actors. So it's incredibly well directed. The performances are great, and the script and the story is great. But I think the rest of it is just serviceable.
Yeah, I agree. The performances are all excellent, and the characters are all really well drawn, very well written, very well directed. Um, I'm not sure in terms of the technical side of it, how good it is compared to the other films. I was mainly watching for the story, but I think that one of the things that I think he was going for was a little bit of that Italian neo-realism kind of thing that was going on, where it was kind of like he wanted it to be more realistic, more real, more gritty, I think, than the average Hollywood film at the time. And I think that's why we get some really interesting characters here, because they're not really, it's hard to say, are they good, are they bad? There's characters who have a real mix of qualities, and I think it does feel more real in a way than a lot of other Hollywood films of the day, or that came before this one. So I think he was going for that kind of neo-realist feel in a way, which might mean that you're not doing as fancy, in terms of camera work or whatever. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know if that's something he gave thought to or not, but just that kind of grittier, realistic feel, I think, was something he wanted for this film.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't innovative in terms of like there were a few crime films that were experimenting with doing on location shooting. It wasn't any of that like, oh my God, I really feel like I'm in the streets. I really feel dirty. I really feel like this shot is really cool. I really feel like, oh, this the way they're telling this story is so different than other stories. I think all that other stuff is conventional, which is fine. It was intended to be like a B movie. The fact that we're even talking about it now is a small miracle. And again, I love this movie, but I think
Mm-hmm.
everything you're mentioning is dealing with writing and directing, which is what is really good in this film is the writing and the direction. And you mentioned that too, that the realism. There was a point where the one of the women were crying and she removed her fake eyelashes. That's something that you would never think of like like name a big time actress at the time, even allowing themselves to be in a position like Betty Davis or Audrey Hepburn or Katharine Hepburn. It's like, they have to look perfectly flawless. The idea that they would even have fake eyelashes is just like, oh, you gasp, like, no, those are her, she grew those are hers, it's like, so I think that's part of the realism you're talking about is just a simple scene like that, things like that is really where it stands out. But
Yeah.
like I said, I mean, there's a lot to like about this movie. Sterling Hayden, not your typical lead, and I think you would say that's another thing. It's like, who is really the lead of this film? It's
Mm-hmm.
very much an ensemble thing. You start off with like one character, you end with other characters. I guess Hayden is kind of the character that pulls it together, but there are large stretches of the film where he's either not in it or he's just kind of along for the ride in the scenes. Like he's not pushing the scene along, he's just kind of standing in the background, literally standing in the background of some of the bigger scenes in the film. So it's definitely storytelling wise, it's definitely follows a lot of the characters and a lot of the different journeys. And the fact that it was close to 2 hours long at a time, I guess this was 50, so it's around the time when films started expanding in length, and maybe some of the other studios did have longer films. But typically, you're talking about from the 30s to the 50s, where there wasn't a lot of films that had third acts. So kind of when the climax happened, the film ended. Especially with the action, crime, noir, gangster films, they generally ended, at the climax. And then they just did a quick wrap up where it's like, all right, all the bad guys went to jail or got killed, and the cops were right, and blah blah blah. So the fact that this had that extra time to really develop the characters and really like make it flesh things out, I think was incredibly unusual, and it also benefited the film a lot as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're right. It is kind of an ensemble piece. It doesn't feel like we're following one character, although we do kind of start with Sterling Hayden and we kind of end with him. But yeah, he's not quite. I don't know. He doesn't feel like he's at the center of it for a lot of the film. I think you're right. He's there, but he's just one of the characters. And the film kind of does show you what happens to all the characters. They sort of take the time to show, here's what happens to this guy, here's what happens to this guy. And in that way, it kind of takes me back again to Maudlin's 11, or I assume Ocean's 11, where, you see each character has their own kind of downfall. You kind of see the tragedy or whatever of what happens to them all. But yeah, I do think it's definitely an ensemble piece. One thing that I find interesting, it was MGM, as you said, that did this movie, and Louis B. Mayer, who was, in charge of MGM, he apparently didn't like the film, and he said, "It's trash. That asphalt pavement thing is full of nasty, ugly people doing nasty, ugly things. I wouldn't cross the street to see a picture like that." So that was his take on it. And I mean, I know what he means, because the characters are not all clearly good. Like, like the characters who are kind of good, there's also kind of negative sides to them. Like there are a lot of I guess it's human, really, is what it is. The characters are human. They all have kind of a dark side, or they do things that aren't so great. Um, so it's not like a movie with a clear hero, I guess, somebody that you can really admire. But
Yeah,
I find that, yeah, I just find that interesting that he dismissed his own movie with those words.
yeah. I never heard that quote, but two things come to mind with that quote. Leave out that I wouldn't cross the street to see that movie. And that quote, aside from that, the end part, makes me want to watch. If I heard something about a movie, like I'd be like, where can I watch this movie? And how soon can I see it? He's actually selling the movie with a lot of what he's saying, aside from the fact to say he wouldn't cross the street to watch it. But that's an incredible quote. A
It,
and
yeah.
B, there is a scene that kind of exemplifies that. And the scene that exemplifies that is one of the things I love most about the film, and one of the things I like the least about the film. There's an early scene in the diner, and you have this guy, I guess he's like a hunchback. I didn't even realize that till late in the film.
Mhm.
I wasn't paying attention, but he's this hunchback guy. He's kind of a shade of gray character because he's helping his criminal friend, but then it seems like if he's not helping his friend, he's just running a legitimate business. And then you have he's this customer, this truck driver in the back who's just trying to leech and read magazines for free. And it's like, no, you buy that, put it down. I remember I was yelled at all the time as a kid because I had no money, but I tried to read these comic books, and you always be told, stop reading the book, either buy it or put it down. You can only look at the cover. So you have this guy
Yeah.
leeching, this truck driver leeching, and then here's this Sterling Hayden after he's just pissed off because he owes a gambling debt, and he's this degenerate gambler, and he has no money, and he's down on his luck. He's in there like moping around. And then you have this cat eating on top of the counter where they're serving food. I'm like, look at this filthy little diner. Imagine walking into a diner, you're seeing a cat eating food where you're supposed to be eating, and you have a criminal at the front. You have some guy reading magazines, cursing back and forth with the owner, and he's kicking him out. It was like, this feels like a dirty, filthy. This sounds like the quote that I just heard. The only thing missing, again, that's what I loved about it. It felt worn out. It felt lived in. The city, the movie, everything felt great about that. The thing that I liked the least about this film is that I didn't really feel pulled into the scene because it was just this one flat shot, and it was just almost like a stage play. There wasn't any cutting in between. There wasn't any close-ups of like the dirty counter or the cat eating. Nothing was emphasized with the shot composition. It was just one flat shot. So I think if that was maybe cut together with a few different angles, or just like emphasizing like how worn in or filthy the place was, that would have enhanced like the feeling that Louis felt. It's like I would have felt more like how he felt. Like, man, this place, I feel dirty watching this movie.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And what I found interesting was the cat, because you do see cats in some movies, and some people, I think there's somebody on Twitter who really catalogs all these cats in movies. And so I thought, oh, look, there's a cat, it's a real cat. But what I've really found interesting was that that's what the character really cared about, is that the truck driver basically said he runs over cats whenever he can because he thinks they're terrible. And so when he tosses him out, he says, if I ever see you run over a cat, I'll kill you, or something like that. And so it's kind of showing us the good in him in a way, because he's standing up for the cats, yeah, I found that very interesting.
yeah, yeah. Definitely a movie with a lot of good layers writing wise, and it benefited again a lot from having more time than contemporary films at that time as well, that it would be compared to. Brief cameo by Marilyn Monroe. I wish she had a little bit more screen time,
Yes.
but it was nice to see, Marilyn Monroe in all her beauty.
Hmm.
Sterling Hayden, a good character actor. He's in a lot more great films than you think. I mean, he was in Suddenly. He was in The Godfather. He was in The Killing, which is a similar movie to this. He was in Doctor Strangelove. Just a guy who is kind of unassuming, not a lot of range, When he plays the good guy, which I've seen him do when he plays the bad guy, he's still the same character. He's just like this tough, no nonsense type guy, whether he's a criminal or he's a hero, whether he's saving the day or whether he's trying to like, commit some kind of crime. It's pretty much he's just going to be Sterling Hayden, and you got to ride around him. You gotta you ride around him. He's not He's not playing any other character, but he shows up in a lot of surprisingly a lot of great films and serviceable. Just like a lot of the film is filled with a lot of character actors like that, where it's just like, oh, I know his face from this or his face from that. You may not know their names, but a lot of serviceable character actors that were given some good material to work with, and they delivered.
Yeah, for sure. And Sterling Hayden's character here, they refer to him as a hooligan. He's basically just a thug. He's like a big, strong thug. But again, I think the movie shows that he's more than that. They give us more. They show us that he's not just a thug. But yeah, he's a big, imposing guy, and he's scary. He seems like somebody who would be very threatening. And it's interesting, he did have kind of a late career resurge with movies like The Godfather, sort of appearing as an older guy. So, and it's still kind of like you say, he's still kind of like a thug in there in a way. He was a cop though, right? In The Godfather.
Yeah, he was a corrupt cop.
The corrupt cop, yeah. So, yeah, definitely interesting.
He was in a film called Crime Wave, which is a really unassuming little film noir that I just love. I just love it. And he was a good guy in that, but he basically played the same character in this and in Godfathers. And he was a good guy in Suddenly too, but again, the same character.
Yeah. Well, and in this movie, it's sort of like, is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? He's kind of both. He treads the line here in a way. He's ultimately, I guess, a bad guy because he breaks the law, but in some ways, he's kind of a good guy.
Yeah, which people say that about me, Wait a minute, did I just admit to breaking the law on this podcast?
Apparently, yes. I'm shocked. I'm scandalized.
Okay, we could wrap. I'm sorry, you want to add more?
Well, I was just going to say, fortunately, there's no Hays Code today, so you can break the law today and still have a happy ending. But I think at that time you couldn't.
And that happy ending is a double entendre, I'm assuming.
Well, I guess it could be.
Because while I'm having the happy ending, I technically breaking the law, right? So
I think so. Yeah, I think you would be.
Yeah. Unless I'm in Nevada or something. So, but yeah, we'll wrap it up there. Definitely a highly recommended film. It may not be the all-time classic that a few of his other films are, Huston, but this is definitely a classic. Definitely worth seeking out. And again, you may watch it thinking, oh, I've seen this stuff before and I like the way it was executed better because it's modern actors, modern acting styles, it's bigger budgets, it's not black and white, it's glossier, it's all these other things. But you have to think like context matters. This was made almost 75 years ago, and it's you're still relating it to films that are big successes now. So put into the proper context, it's historic, it's memorable, it's a fun watch.
Yeah, I agree. And the only thing I would add is that perhaps if I had seen it earlier in my life, maybe it would be something that I would love as much as the others. I don't know. But even though I do think I saw it at some point, much like you, I couldn't remember anything really. So it's, I think I need to see it again. I think I need to watch this movie again. And it's a good enough movie, I definitely will. Yeah, it's maybe not quite as much of a classic as the others, but definitely well worth watching.
Yeah, I mean, if this is one of your first caper or heist films you saw, I think you're going to have a huge affinity for it because you're going to be like, oh, wow, this is so cool. And then when you watch modern movies, you're going to be like, oh, man, they're just ripping off this this Asphalt Jungle movie. Let me go on Twitter and tell everybody, hashtag cancel this, like this movie is like ripping off the asphalt jungle. You can go up on your high horse, your soapbox, and just spew knowledge to people. Listen, let me drop you some knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Yeah, you may like these movies, but I can tell you about a movie that was made way before that you never heard of. And you can be that guy that annoys people with your film knowledge, like the rest of us on this podcast, me and yourself. So, but yeah,
Yes,
yeah, definitely a good time.
yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, I'll be seeing it again in the future for sure. The Asphalt Jungle. We open with a police car driving through the streets while a voice speaks over the police radio. And it's kind of setting up what I think is the major world of this film, which is kind of police work, or the world of police. And we see a man on the street. He hides from the police car. And then he goes into a cafe and he hands the owner his gun. And the owner hides the gun in a cash register. Two cops come in and they wind up booking the man on vagrancy charges and they take him in. And we see an old fashioned police lineup. It's a room full of cops and witnesses. It feels like an auction. All these people are waiting for a suspect that they're going to bid on. And the suspects are in the same room with all the witnesses. They're not behind glass, there's no two-way mirror. And that may become significant in a moment. So, this is where we find out about our man, the guy we saw get arrested. His name is Dix Handley. He's 36 years old, born in Kentucky. And he was arrested for illegal possession of firearms and sentenced to 1 to 5 years, but he escaped prison and then was rearrested, etc. He's got a long, criminal record. And the witness, who's perhaps going to ID him for pulling an armed robbery the night before, the witness refuses to ID him. And the impression that we get is that he's lying, and the cop, who happens to be named Lieutenant Dietrich, is upset by this and surprised. And you get the sense that this is probably typical, that these witnesses are maybe afraid and refuse to ID the guy. And who can blame them when the guy's in the same room with them and is able to see them? So the commissioner calls Dietrich in and sort of gives him a long list of crimes that are going on in his precinct. And Dietrich says that he knows who the guy is who's doing these, and it's Dix Handley, our friend. And but the witness got cold feet and he backed down. So the commissioner says, "Well, lean on that witness harder." And then he asks questions like, "Why are the gambling parlors still open? Smash them harder." And it seems to me like the commissioner is almost condoning police violence here, or police brutality. He's like, just get more violent with these guys, do something. And hand in hand with the fact that they bring him in for vagrancy, which is kind of a trumped up charge. The impression I get here is that the police may not be entirely noble or above board. And I feel that this is our kind of introduction to this world. What do you think about that?
Yeah, first of all, let's go to the name of our lead character. Dix Handley. It sounds like Dick Handy or something, or like I don't know. It
Yes, it
sounds like
does.
maybe a play on words, or maybe like an inside joke or something, but a masturbation joke or something. But yeah, this kind of plays into what a lot of 80s films would be. So I grew up probably in like late 80s, 90s, watching like a lot of action movies. And they would have these like weird name. I think even The Simpsons made fun of it once too, like Max Powers and like, Strong Armly or something like that. Maybe this is
Yes,
where it started. Movies like this, where it's just like you can't just have like a regular name for your tough guy. The tough guys always have to have tough guy names. And if you didn't know this
yes,
guy was a tough guy by the fact that like, his he's scraping his skull as he walks into a door, because he's so tall and so brooding. Just the name alone, Dix Handley says it all. So it's a seedy world. He's a seedy character. I think the tone is beautifully set. They set up Lieutenant Dietrich, which I thought was going to be a more prominent character, but he disappears for a while and then
Mhm.
comes back at the end. Which again, this movie is longer than other films at its time frame, almost 2 hours, so it had time to do things like that instead of just being a nameless, fameless character. They give you time to set him up a little bit. So when he comes back at the end, it's like you have certain feelings for him, either good or bad, but at least you feel something when you see him on screen. So yeah, I like the setup so far. I'm intrigued and I want to see more.
For sure. And we learn right away about a character named Doc Erwin Riedenschneider. And we learn this from the commissioner, who's still kind of giving shit to Lieutenant Dietrich here because apparently this Doc guy has just been released from prison. And Dietrich and his men were supposed to be watching him, keeping an eye on him. And Doc managed to give them the slip. And so he's missing now. They don't know where he is. The commissioner's mad, and he wants Dietrich to fix this situation. And then from there, we actually get to meet Doc as a cabbie drops him off. And what I find really interesting is we don't see his face right away. It's really kind of an interesting moment. The car kind of cuts off his face from our view, and then he turns and walks into the building, and so we're seeing him from behind. And we follow him a long way, and he goes to a door and he talks to someone, and he's kind of a shadow, and we don't see him at all. And then finally, as he's waiting for somebody to come out and talk to him, he turns back toward us and kind of walks toward us, kind of pacing around. And so we finally see his face. I found that kind of a really interesting introduction of the character. And so he winds up meeting with this guy, Cobby, who we learn very quickly is a bookie. And Doc is pitching him on an idea. But Cobby is not really interested until he figures out who Doc is. And then he gets excited. So Doc has a plan for a caper that will earn $500,000, but he needs $50,000 up front to sort of operate. And Cobby doesn't really have that kind of money, but perhaps a guy named Mr. Emmerlich does. And Doc knows that Cobby can connect him to Mr. Emmerlich. So that's this sort of section here. What did you think about this?
Yeah, so I was fascinated with the Doc character, and it kind of, like I said previously, I grew up on kind of like 80s and 90s, movies and TV shows and such. So while these movies are a little bit older for me in terms of like having a direct influence on me, I think these movies had an influence on the people that made the movies and TV shows that I watched. Because here you have this Doc character, short, unassuming, polite, smart, and then you got the muscle that's behind him in Dick's Handley, you know? And how many like TV shows or movies or cartoons have you seen where you have this mastermind, unassuming bad guy and this big brooding guy that's the muscle, you know? Speaking of 80s action movies, Thunderdome, Mad Max, Master Blaster, and just like countless other things you can think of where you have this quiet, like polite, unassuming guy, but he's very dangerous. His mind is dangerous. And I'll just beat him up. No, but he's got this brooding muscle behind him. So I like the dynamic that would later develop with him and Dix. And I like this character. I thought his character was interesting in that he wasn't like a tough talking or he wasn't intimidating. He wasn't what you would expect, but he works.
Yeah, I like him a lot too, and I would call him kind of the gentleman bandit or something like that. He's kind of the very gentlemanly good guy in a way. He just happens to be a bad guy. And we'll see over the course of the film that he actually is very reasonable in a lot of situations.
Very pragmatic.
Yeah. And, again, the idea that are these guys good or are they bad? He seems like kind of a good guy most of the time. But we'll talk more about that as we go. And it's interesting that right away is where we do kind of get to know Dix, because Dix comes in while Doc is there, and he's wanting to see Cobby because he wants to make a bet. but he already owes $2,300 and a little more. And so Cobby says, yeah, okay, he gives him permission, but he manages to offend Dix. And Dix says one of the most interesting lines in the movie. He says, "Don't bone me. Don't bone me." And he and he basically says he's going to go and get all the money he owes right now. And so he goes back and he wants to get his gun from the cafe owner where, you know, it was stashed earlier. The cafe owner, we learn, is a guy named Gus. And he says no, and he sort of gives him advice, you know, knock off for a while, the police are all over, you know, the situation's too hot. And he even offers to give Dix the money that he needs to pay off his debt so that he will owe Gus instead of Cobby. And so again, we're seeing Gus as a pretty good guy here. He's helping out his friend here, and he's willing to give him essentially all the money he has to help him out. And then he winds up calling a guy, Louis Chiavelli, to ask for $1,300 as part of the money to give to Dix. And this is where we meet Louis Chiavelli, who will become important. And he's got a wife and kids, which we will also keep hearing about throughout the movie. We also meet a woman named Doll, who visits Dix. And she needs a place to stay for a couple of days. And he says, okay, but don't get any ideas. And we sort of get the sense that she maybe is in love with him, and he's kind of, you know, a little bit aloof. Any thoughts on this deepening of the Dix character?
You want me to go deep in Dick?
Only if you want to. Only
Pause.
If you want to.
So yeah, there's an assault of characters here because there's a lot of characters being thrown at you here, and you learn a little bit about all of them, despite the fact that there's an assault on characters in this segment of the movie. So what do we know about Dix? We know that he's kind of self-destructive in a way, in that like he has, even after he leaves, Cobb says, "Oh, he always loses" or whatever. He's a degenerate gambler. He doesn't think much of him. And that gives you a little insight to Cobb. He's not very loyal. You just threw him under the bus as soon as he left. So he doesn't really have much of a spine. That shows you a little bit about who Cobb is, or Cobby. And Dix, you know, he has a gambling problem. You know, he's a little hot-headed. He just, give me my gun, like I'll figure this out, you know? So he has his little addiction. We know Doll, she has a soft spot for him. That's her weakness. We see Doc looking at the calendar with the beautiful women. We know that's his weakness. And poor was it Lewis is the other guy, or Louis?
Yeah, I think so. Yes,
yeah. Well, that character, we know the minute he, poor guy, the minute he started, he was about to leave. He's talking about his kid, and then he's about to leave, and then he goes back and shows Doc the photos of his kid. I'm like, this guy's he's not going to make it through this movie. Exactly. The minute he started showing off photos of his kid, I'm like, yeah, he's going to die. He's going to die for sure. You know, I've seen enough movies to know the minute he starts talking about his kid, I'm like, yeah, they're setting us up to let us know that character ain't going to make it to the end of the movie. So we already know what his situation is. So not only are all these, again, you're being assaulted by a lot of characters, but you know a little bit about each of them. And the information you're given is going to be pivotal to either who that character is or how their downfall is going to play out.
Yeah, for sure. So then from there, we get the plan as Doc pitches Emmerlich with Cobby. Needs $50,000. They need a fence or maybe 2 or 3 fences to sell the jewels when they steal them. They need 3 guys, a boxman, a driver, and a hooligan. And Emmerlich offers to look into selling the stuff himself, you know, instead of going through a fence. You know, you'll make more money. Let me do it. Let me look into it. And then we meet Emmerlich's mistress, who is Marilyn Monroe. She calls him Uncle Lon, and you know, very good performance, very good character. Emmerlich calls his private detective buddy Bob Bannum, and he sends him out to collect debts that are owed to him so he can raise the $50,000 to pay for this heist here. They owe him 100 grand total, so he figures he can easily get the money. Um, any thoughts about this?
Yeah. So we see Emmerich, and his attitude is kind of weird because you're thinking, oh, here's this big money guy, and he says something odd. If he's the big money guy, they're talking about $500,000. And when you talk about $500,000 you're going to be making, and you only got to pay this one guy 50 grand, like, why is he volunteering to do it himself? Generally, these big money guys keep their hands clean. They don't do things. They're like, hey, I manage a hotel, right? Sometimes I have to do stuff like unclogging toilets and things like that. I'm going to be the GM soon. But I'm not going to say, hey, like, you know what? Instead of me hiring a housekeeper, why don't I just clean the rooms? Yeah, yeah, it's like you wouldn't expect that. I mean, you can do it, but you wouldn't expect it. It's like, wait a minute, aren't you busy doing other things? Like, wouldn't you hire someone with, you know, delegate, like, why would you get your hands dirty? For me, literally, but for him, figuratively, when you could just, yeah, what's $50,000? You're the money guy, you're going to be making all this money. So his behavior was kind of peculiar there. And then, yeah, his henchman, definitely, definitely shady, definitely someone who you think is gonna play into the film with his attitude. Like, this kind of tough guy. There's another tough guy in this movie. You kind of had a feeling these tough guys are gonna have some kind of a showdown. That's how these
Yes.
things typically play out. So you kind of saw, yeah, let's see, you kind of anticipate a showdown with him and Dix a little bit. And of course, as you mentioned, Marilyn Monroe, in a very small role, but she certainly is not your typical film noir. She doesn't have the acting chops for that, but she certainly does well in this very limited role. And it's good to see a young, very beautiful Marilyn Monroe in this film.
Yes, for sure. And so then Dix talks about his childhood and a horse and the family farm and how it all goes bad. And it's his dream to sort of buy back the family farm someday. He also talks about losing all his money on a horse, and he figures that, well, his luck has to turn one of these days. He pays Cobby back the money that he owes, and he once again says, "You boned me." And Cobby apologizes, and he introduces Dix to Doc, and kind of refers to him as a hooligan. And Doc sort of takes interest and goes, "He's a hooligan." Uh, so then Doc sort of talks about the fact that he's heard that Emmerich is broke, and Cobby says, "No, no, that's not true." And then Lieutenant Dietrich comes in, and he kind of goes out again, and he says, "I didn't see anybody." And then he kind of says to Cobby, "You're going to have to stand still for a raid." Cobby kind of argues with him, and so they wind up saying, "Okay, well, you close up." And so basically what we're kind of learning here is that Lieutenant Dietrich is on the take. He's not a clean cop, whereas in the first scene he seemed completely above board and very concerned, and we kind of felt sorry for him because things are going wrong. But it turns out he's on the take, which puts a whole new slant on the fact that the gambling parlors are still open and he's not smashing them hard enough. Doc comments that he doesn't trust cops. He says, "Experience has taught me never to trust a policeman. Just when you think one's all right, he turns legit." Any thoughts on any of this?
A lot of foreshadowing here. A lot of foreshadowing.
Yes,
Dix with the horse.
Yes.
First of all, it makes you empathize with him. He's not just a
Yes.
degenerate gambler. You kind of know where the gambling is coming from. He's just desperate to get back to the past and get back that house, get back to a better time in his life, maybe mentally, maybe it's metaphorically he wants it, not just
Yeah.
literally. And the gambling and losing his money on a horse, wanting to get back to the farm with the horses. It's just a lot of foreshadowing, a lot more insight to his character. And again, with Doc, about a bad cop going good, foreshadowing there. The dynamic with
Yes.
Cobb and Dietrich, where it's just like,
Yeah.
hey, Cobb kind of has the upper hand when Dietrich is dirty, but when Dietrich turns clean, then the power balance kind of flips. While he's dirty, he's kind of at the mercy of the criminals. When he's clean, he's kind of at the mercy of the law and his superiors. So you kind of see there's a lot of foreshadowing with a lot of stuff going on here. Also with Emmerich, the whole thing like not, thinking that he's broke. Again, a lot of
Yeah.
things are being set up.
Yeah. Absolutely. And yeah, it does humanize Dix a little bit more. Like he's not just a thug. He's not just a bad guy. He's got these very human feelings, and he's kind of sensitive. He wants to get back to that family farm. So yeah, it's all very interesting. So from here, the private detective Bob Bannum comes up empty. Emmerlich is upset and he confesses that he's broke and he needs a way out. He's desperate. And he basically convinces Bob to help him double cross the others. And he basically suggests that they're going to steal the gems and they'll split the proceeds 50-50. And yeah, so this is where things are really starting to turn. And the team is put together. Louis Chiavelli, the man with the wife and kids, he's the box man. He's going to be the guy who opens the safe. And Chiavelli, he suggests Gus as the getaway driver, Gus being our diner owner, the hunchback. And then Doc asks about Dix Handley, for the hooligan, because he's met him in the office a couple of times and he kind of liked him, and so they say, okay, sure, why not? At this point, Dahl moves out of his place and moves in with a girlfriend, and she gives Dix the address where she will be. And then they plan the heist, and Doc asks Dix about Emmerlich, and he admits that he doesn't trust him, and he wants Dix sort of prepared in case things go wrong. And when we see Emmerlich, he's packing suitcase, his passport, everything. And his wife wants him to stick around and play cards and spend time with her, but he says, no, I gotta go take care of business. And so that's when we're about to move into the next section. Any thoughts on all of this?
Yeah, thank God the driver he recommended was a character that was already set up for us.
Exactly.
Or we'd have to more characters and more introductions and more backstories and more foreshadowing. So yeah, it just so happens that Gus, a character we already saw, happens to be someone he recommends to be the driver. But aside from that plot device there, a lot of interesting things going on, a lot of layers being added to what is already a pretty layered film as we're already watching. So not only do we have the typical scene where it's like, all right, we're planning out the heist. You do this, you do. It's a scene you've seen a lot of times in a lot of movies, either legitimate movies or parodies of these movies, but it's a scene you've seen a million times where they plan it out. You do this, you do that. This guy does this guy does that, and all the whole plan's going to come together. And then we get a snag in that plan where we have betrayal. So it's not just the anticipation of, is it going to go down? Is it going to go down without a hitch? Like, is something going to go wrong? But we also have, even if it goes right, then there's this other layer of betrayal that's going to happen to once the heist is over. So it gives you more anticipation. You're anticipating the heist going down and what's going to happen after the heist goes down with this betrayal. So there's a lot of tension going on. And another layer. So you just thought that, this Emmerich guy just had, a young mistress, but it turns out he also has a wife, and she seems like a nice character, which again adds another layer to this. Like, wait a minute, he's married, Like, so
Yeah.
and they make her a nice character, and they gave her some vulnerability in that you see there's certain awareness that she has that like she's trying to keep up appearances and look pretty for him and things like that.
Hmm.
So definitely a lot of layers added to the film at this point.
Yes, absolutely. And this is where we pull the heist. And as we've maybe already referred to, you can see the tropes of every other heist movie that's ever come after this. It's all very familiar, but I think perhaps very fresh in its day. And one of the most important moments is when the box man is about to open the safe, and he's using, I believe, nitroglycerin. And he says it's going to take a lot to blow this baby, and he does. But this is where it all goes bad because the explosion is so big that it sets off several alarms in the neighborhood. So now there's a lot of attention being drawn, and they can hear sirens coming. And so they have to make a decision. What do they do? And they decide we're going to keep going. We've come this far. We're going to get the jewels, and they do. But unfortunately, on the way out, Dick slugs the watchman, but the watchman's gun goes off and hits Ciavelli. Ciavelli being the man with the wife and kids that we keep hearing about throughout the film. And Gus wants to take him to a doctor, but he says, no, no, take me home. Take me home. So Doc and Dix go to Emmerlich's place, but they see through Emmerlich's attempt to stall them, and realizing this, Banham kind of goes rogue and he pulls his gun, and there's a bit of a standoff, and he winds up getting shot and killed by Dix, but Dix also gets shot kind of in the side. It's a flesh wound, it's not too bad. But obviously the double cross has not gone the way it should. And Dix wants to kill Emmerlich, but Doc stops him. And this is one of the interesting moments where Doc really shows his kind of, I don't know, his humanity or something. He kind of scolds Emmerlich for this stupid plan of his, and he asks him questions, and he basically says to him, you know what, why don't you call the insurance company, because they will probably pay, no questions asked, to get these jewels back. And so he seems like a person of character, Doc. He's kind of being helpful even in this situation when they could just kill the guy and run out with the jewels. It's like, no, we're kind of screwed here. This has gone bad. Just give the jewels back to the insurance company. We'll get less money, but hey, we'll all do okay. He's taken the high road. He's the voice of reason here. And meanwhile, Ciavelli's wife wants him taken to the hospital. But, that would mean it would get reported and he'd get arrested. And so Gus sends for a doctor that they can trust. So maybe I'll just ask you at this point, do you have anything to say about this?
Yeah, so this happens kind of halfway or not even halfway through the film. The heist goes down. So
Mhm.
generally these heist movies play out in one or two ways. One, it happens early on, and then the heist just sets up other things. The fallout from the heist then becomes the main storyline. Or if the heist happens towards the end of the film, then the heist is the main storyline. So because the heist was happening so early, you kind of realize this movie is not peaking with the heist. It's peaking with the aftermath of the heist. So the heist was interesting, a lot of tension, a lot of things that were set up paid off. Oh man, I love my wife and kid. I look at my kid. Oh man, I'm such a proud dad. Oh, I'm shot, fatally shot.
Yes. Oh dear. Yeah.
Who saw that coming?
Everyone, I think. Yes.
So I thought it was interesting in that also it gave the way the film played out, it gave Gus something to do. Gus, otherwise kind of an innocuous character, except he happens to have a hunchback, which I didn't even realize honestly till like deep into the film. I'm like, oh, he's a hunchback, because it was kind of understated. The guy kind of made a joke at him when he threw him out the bar, when he said he ran over, threw him out the diner when he said he ran over cats and stuff. So he made
Yeah.
a joke about it. But I thought he was just joking. I didn't realize he
Yeah.
was an actual hunchback. Um, so yeah, it gave him something to do in that dynamic where he's then arguing with the wife about calling the doctor and things like that. So I thought that was interesting because typically in these movies, back then they weren't long enough. So when they talked about certain like, spouses and stuff, if it wasn't the spouse of a main character, they may not get any screen time. So I was even shocked that we saw his wife on screen, that she was an actual character. So the
Yeah.
interaction with her and Gus I thought was interesting because it was unexpected. It wasn't scenes that I thought we would end up seeing coming. I just thought we'd hear off screen, oh, he died, and that would
Yeah.
be the end of his character and the end of everything, the end of the
Yeah.
Hunchback, the end of all that stuff. So I thought those scenes were great. They added more tension and more drama to the film, and of course the betrayal. And as the
Yes.
betrayal scene is happening, again, I thought I saw this movie, but at this point, I'm realizing I never saw it because there's so much going on that I don't have any memory of. But as the scene is playing, I'm like, this scene's kind of going on pretty long. I'm like, they're not going to believe him. If they were going to believe him, this scene would have ended already, So it's like the longer he
Yeah.
keeps saying, yeah, and then the more he keeps having to explain himself, I'm getting the sense that like, oh, like shit's gonna go down here and now. Like this isn't gonna
Yeah.
be a betrayal they find out later, they come back for revenge. I'm like, no, this is gonna play out now, how long this scene is playing out. And then you
Yeah.
got your showdown, with the two tough guys and the shootout, and Dix gets shot. And this is where I realize that I love dark endings. Like for me, growing up, some of my favorite movies were like those 1970s, I think they were the 70s, might have been the 60s, Shaw Brothers films,
Mm.
those kung fu films, because they would always end, and most of the time the hero would die at the end. And it's like it was so different from every other thing you see where it's just a happy ending. And I was like, I love dark endings, but holy shit, this is a bleak movie. Like nothing is going right for anyone. These
Yeah.
characters started off at the bottom, and they're just getting lower somehow. Like nothing.
Yeah.
Like they make you care about these characters because you empathize because they're in such bad situations, and
Yeah.
the situations just get worse. Usually in some of these, like even like Across 110th Street, a kind of a bleak film, at least they have the money for a little while, and then the mob
Yep.
comes and gets back at them. But there's no respite of there's no period of time where it's just like, all right, they're enjoying life. No, life is just shit, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. Oh yeah, you happy you got a nice family? Here's a bullet to the gut. Oh, you think you got a nice husband? Oh, your husband's about to die in the bedroom next to your kid. It's like, oh, Sterling Hayden, yeah, you just saved him. Oh, you got shot too. It's just like, and the guy who's doing the betrayal, he like breaks down and just says, oh, like I'm pathetic, like I have nothing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it just felt really, really bleak to me, the movie.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely, and we're not even at the end yet.
No.
It's already there. But yeah, and so surprisingly, Emmerlich winds up dumping his buddy Bob's body in the river, um, which surprised me. Because it seems like again like he would have somebody else to do that, or he wouldn't want to dirty his hands, but he dumps the body. And the police come to see him, and he is making nice with his wife at that point. They're actually having kind of a nice moment. And the police explain to him that Bob is dead. They found him in the water, and in his pocket he had a list of a bunch of names on Emmerlich's letterhead. And so Emmerlich explains, oh yeah, those are the guys who owe me money, and Bob was trying to get the money back, etc., etc. And they question Emmerlich, and he lies about his whereabouts and says that he was with his mistress, Angela. And so they say, okay, cool, they leave. And then he calls Angela and basically tells her to say that he was there. And then he winds up, when he tells his wife the bad news, and she's like, oh man, that's horrible, criminals, blah, blah, blah. He says, crime is only a left-handed form of human endeavor. which I find quite interesting. Um, so meanwhile, Doc and Dix, um, Doc has to talk him down when the news hits the newspaper that Emmerlich, you know, what's happened here, and you know, he you know, Doc says, no, Emmerlich did not betray us. You know, I guess the news hit the paper that Doc is probably the one behind this, and so Emmerlich didn't betray us because, you know, there's only 2 or 3 guys who could have pulled this heist, and they know, you know, and so they just kind of guessed that it's me. And again, I found it interesting that he was kind of being the voice of reason there. They wind up going to Dahl's place, and Doc itemizes how everything went wrong for no good reason. And Dahl sees that he's the one with the price on his head, and perhaps is thinking that they could turn him in, but Dix shuts her down right away. Because Dix basically is a man of honor. You know, this is what we've kind of learned about him. You know, he owes money. Well, damn it, he's going to go get that money and he's going to pay it back. You know, and then when he gets mad at Emmerlich, it's like, what's wrong with you, man? Like, you know, you don't have any honor. And so here, you know, he could probably turn on Doc, but he's not going to because he's a man of honor. So yeah, I find that very interesting. And as the police are sort of, you know, closing in here, and they know that they're looking for, or they're talking about Emmerlich here. They suspect him, and the commissioner says, "An educated man who uses his brains to circumvent the law. Worst type of human being. No excuse for it." Again, another line that I like. So a taxi driver fingers Doc, or rather he says that he went to see Cobby, and so they call Lieutenant Dietrich, and Dietrich basically turns on Cobby, and he basically tells him to turn state's evidence, and you know, he basically says, if we take you in, they're going to work you over at the station. You know, they're going to beat you up, and you're not going to be able to take it. Which again, I find interesting. It's like the police are basically saying, "Hey, we're going to use you know, illegal means here to make you talk." He also says the commish is out for blood, the commissioner, and it's not going to be mine. Cobby threatens to talk about Lieutenant Dietrich, and so Dietrich beats Cobby, and Cobby basically breaks. Thoughts?
Yeah, definitely interesting segment. It definitely shows you the character of Dix. He even gives Doc $1,000. It's like, not only is he not turning him in, he's giving him money. So
Yes.
they were going above and beyond to make Dix look like a good guy at this point. I was like, yeah, I could see him letting him go, but then giving him giving him money too. It's like, man, you really want us to side with Dix, don't you? You know, obviously Doll. I mean, she is a good girl. She's just mixed up with this, and she loves Dix. You know, a lot of women love Dix. So,
Indeed.
but yeah, I mean, yeah. So definitely a lot of interesting. Again, Doc, very pragmatic guy, very even tempered, doesn't go up or down. You know, just he's kind of just like level headed the whole time, just trying to figure out, all right, what do we do now? Like, all right, yeah, this is the hand we're dealt. How are we going to deal with it? Speaking of hands being dealt, you also have an interesting sequence where you have Emmerich playing cards with his wife on the bed, and it cuts then to Dix and Doc, and Dix playing cards on the bed. So kind of like mirroring those two scenes as well. So definitely some interesting things done there. The drama, again, high tension, a lot of interesting things going on. And yeah, we're about to hit our climax.
Yeah, we are. We're getting close. Absolutely.
That's what she said.
Yeah. So next, Uncle Lon tells Angela that they'll go away together. But unfortunately, before they can, the commissioner and some of the cops show up, and they tell him that Cobby has signed a confession. And Emmerlich sits down and reads it while the police try to convince Angela to tell the truth about, the alibi that she gave to Emmerlich. And when he's done reading the confession, he basically tells her, yeah, go ahead, tell the truth. And then he asks if it's okay if he goes and calls his wife. So they say okay. So he goes into the other room, and then he writes a note to his wife, but then he tears it up, which I find very interesting. He wrote her a nice little note, but then he tears it up. And then he shoots himself, kills himself. So I find that very interesting. It's, there's a lot you can say about this character, being a sleazy guy, being a bad guy, but there is something classy about this ending where he kind of tells Angela to tell the truth, make sure she's not going to get in trouble, and then he seems to be wanting to do something for his wife. And I feel like even killing himself, it's almost like he's somehow doing something that's going to make things better. I don't know. It's hard for me to articulate it, but I find it very interesting. So then the police go and they try to arrest Chevali, but they discover that he's actually dead. And there's basically a funeral in progress. And they picked up Gus as well, as he was phoning, and he warns the others that trouble's coming. So then in Dahl's apartment, Doc reads about Emmerlich's suicide, and he basically says he was a fool. He would have only gotten a couple of years. And this is the moment where Dix winds up giving him $1,000, and then Doc offers to give Dix some of the jewels, but Dix says no. He just wants to go back home to Kentucky. He doesn't even want anything. And Dix offers to find him a gun, but Doc says no, and he kind of gives us his philosophy of not carrying a gun, which makes perfect sense. If you carry a gun, you wind up murdering a police officer. You're kind of screwed. But if you don't have a gun, well, you just get arrested. No problem. So then Dahl gets a car, but she insists on going with Dix. And, again, we really get the sense that she's in love with Dix. And he kind of looks at her and he says, I don't get it. I just don't get it. So I'm not sure if he doesn't get that she loves him or if he just doesn't understand that she loves him. So Doc persuades a taxi driver to drive him to Cleveland. They stop at a roadside diner where Doc becomes entranced by a pretty young woman dancing to jukebox tunes. And he watches her, but the cabbie tries to get him to leave. And so this is a moment that I find very interesting here. What do you think about this moment where he winds up giving her some nickels so she can play the music? Is this a kind of a sleazy moment, do you think? Or is he just kind of being kind in this moment?
So you want me to comment on the recap you've done so far, or just this particular scene?
Well, you could do the whole recap.
Yeah, I feel if I don't, I'm gonna lose your synopsis and lose where I'm at in the movie.
For sure.
So as far as Emmerich goes, it's pretty interesting because you kind of felt the minute he heard that knock on the door, he knew what he was gonna do.
Mm-hmm.
Just the way he reacted to it, he was just kind of like monotone, and when he was talking, he was kind of emotionless in dealing with everything. It's just like he saw his fate and he just accepted it. Because he was more emotional early on in the film, especially when he explained to Bob about his situation and how he's broke. And he was kind of emotional when he broke down and Bob got killed and he got caught lying and his whole world was crumbling around him.
Mhm.
But here, all that emotion was gone. It's like you can fight fate for so long, and then you just kind of have to accept your reality. And I think he just, the minute he heard that knock on the door, he accepted it. And I just thought his scenes were hilarious. Of course, up until the tragic end, but the way he let the detectives in and then slammed the door in front of the cops' faces. I thought that was the funniest part of the whole movie. The cops started to try to walk in, they just slammed the door in their faces. Start and the detectives, they just started talking to him. They didn't even like make a big deal about it, you know. And they were just talking to him directly. And the way he was talking to Marilyn Monroe and just telling her, yeah, tell him the truth. He didn't even like imply like, tell him what really happened. He didn't say like, all right, tell them you were lying or whatever. He just said, tell them,
Yeah.
And so he kind of left it a little bit ambiguous in like, does he want her to lie or not? Um, so I thought that was interesting. And you're right, writing the letter to his wife, and then tearing it up. It kind of amplifies like his whole relationship with her in a way, in that he never did right by her, and he's thinking like, all right, this is my chance to do right by you. And you don't know if he's thinking in a way, well, I don't want her to feel sorry for me because I treated her poorly this whole time. Like, why have her mourn me after I'm gone? You know, I think maybe that was just him cutting her a break in a way and letting her go. Maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? I like it being ambiguous because you can interpret it how you want. But I just view
Mhm.
that as, because they did have kind of a decent moment together when they were playing cards. You kind of felt there's, she was a little bit happy. She was doing up her hair. She felt like she kind of gave you the impression that little snippet of a scene where she's doing her hair that like, oh, this isn't something he regularly does with her. This is kind of like a big moment for her,
Mhm.
plus a throwaway moment for him. So and then I thought it was interesting, but I kind of saw, again, I didn't remember this movie. I don't think I seen it honestly. But I kind of saw the suicide happening because just of the way he was acting, it's like it seemed very odd and inconsistent with his character. I think he just kind of accepted his fate. I thought Marilyn Monroe was hilarious. Because first of all, I didn't think we'd see her again because we saw her early on, and then they talk about her off screen. There was like a phone conversation where it's like they could have showed her side of that phone conversation that he had with her. They didn't. The
Mhm.
detectives came into the precinct and they talked about interviewing her. We didn't see her. They could have showed us. I'm like, oh, they're just not going to show us her again. So I
Mhm.
was kind of happy we did see her again. And yeah, you never think of her being a good fit for a noir, but she just basically played ditzy and it worked.
Yeah.
It's just like, are we still gonna go on vacation? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, we're gonna go on vacation, honey. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, we're going to San Quentin together. It's just like, but yeah, I thought all that was well done. Yeah, the fact that not Caruso, Lewis, died off screen. I mean, that was fine. We didn't need to. That story was told the minute he got shot in the shootout. We didn't need any more. I think the other scene of just showing the wife and Gus interacting was enough. We didn't need to see any more of those characters. And Gus, it was interesting. Gus stayed true to his character. He kind of was a softie and he had a heart of gold. I think him empathizing with the stray cats showed you like, hey, like he may have his flaws, he may make poor decisions, but he's not a bad guy to a certain extent, in a certain context. And who did he dislike? He didn't dislike anyone that got him into that situation. He disliked the person who snitched. So
Mhm.
he took responsibility for where he was, but he has a certain integrity that he didn't like with Kabi, and that was the only person he kind of lashed out on. He kind of warned his friends, hey, this is going
Yeah.
to happen. And again, Doc, very pragmatic, straight throughout the whole movie, very pragmatic with everything. And we finally get to his fate at the end. And
Yes.
the scene where the girl is dancing, and that does play off because we saw him with the calendar early on, flipping through the
Mhm.
young girls. So yeah, I mean, if this movie were made today, maybe without censorship back then, he's more like a Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein, where he's, this perversion for young girls.
Yeah,
Maybe that's it. Maybe he's not just this innocent guy. Maybe he has his dark side to him. Um,
yeah,
some of the
yeah,
worst criminals, they're completely nice. Like serial killers, when they get caught, and they interview the
mhm,
neighbors, he was always such a nice guy. But then he was
yeah.
eating people, inside his killing people and eating them. So it's like
Yeah,
it kind of plays out kind of like, I think he does have a dark side. Maybe he is into pedophilia and young girls and things like that, but this was just their way of telling it in the 50s.
yeah. Well, that's what I was wondering. Like, is he? Because he's been pretty likable all throughout. And then this moment is the one where you kind of go, what's he doing here? Like, like when he just gives her the nickels, if he had just walked away, I would have thought, oh, he's just being kind. He's giving her the nickels. But he sits down and watches her dance, and the camera is almost leering at her. Her body is kind of really approaching the lens of the camera. And is that supposed to be his POV? And is he lusting after her? Like, what is going on there? I find it very interesting. And I do wonder, are they trying to give us an undercut to his character? We've kind of liked him all along, and now there's something a little weird going on here. I don't know, but yeah, it's very interesting. And so, meanwhile, there are police who are watching through the window. They're watching him watch the girl through the window, and when they come out of the restaurant or whatever, yeah, the restaurant, they kind of
Diner. I
talk
think it
to
was a diner. Yeah.
diner, yeah, diner. Um, the policemen stop him, they talk to him, and they wind up finding the jewels in his coat and arresting him. And he says, "How long have you guys been out here?" And they say 2 or 3 minutes. And he says, "About as long as it takes to play a phonograph record." And I guess in this moment, Doc is realizing his mistake. He took the time to sit and watch the girl dance for one song. And had he left, maybe the police wouldn't have seen him, wouldn't have stopped him. Maybe he would have gotten away. So, kind of an interesting moment. So, meanwhile, Dix is, he's apparently losing blood, and he passes out at the wheel of the car. And so Dahl takes him to see a doctor, and the doctor's going to report this gunshot wound, even though she lies and says it's a car accident or something. But he realizes what's going on, and he kind of gets out of there. They leave. Then at a press conference, Lieutenant Dietrich, we find out, is in jail, and he's going to be tried. So I guess they know now that he was a corrupt cop. And the commissioner says it's not anything strange that there are corrupt officers in police departments. The dirt they're trying to clean up is bound to rub off on some of them, but not all of them. Maybe 1 out of 10, or sorry, 1 out of 100. And so then he kind of demonstrates, he turns on the police radio and he shows how many calls are coming in, and he basically is saying police are overworked, they're trying to get to all these places. And he says, suppose we had no police force, good or bad. The jungle wins. The predatory beasts take over. So is he saying that bad cops are better than no cops? Is that what he's saying in this moment? And then he notes that 3 of the 7 suspects have died, and 3 others are arrested and in jail, and there's only 1 still on the loose. And he's a hardened killer, a hooligan, without any human feeling or human mercy. And I find this very, very interesting and very affecting. It kind of reminds me of a movie that will come much, much later called Unforgiven with Clint Eastwood. Because at the end of that movie, we kind of get the sense that his character is completely unforgiven. He's sort of seen as this terrible, nasty person, no redeeming qualities. but we know different because we've been watching the movie and we've gotten to know him. And I feel that that's kind of where we're at here, is that we've gotten to know these guys, and it's not just dicks. He's talking about dicks, and certainly we've seen Dix as a human side, and he has this sort of philosophy or whatever you want to call it, where he's a good guy, and he's not going to do wrong, even though he's a criminal. Um, and so I guess I might as well go on to say here that this Dix basically proves him wrong in this moment, because he sort of continues on until he gets to, I guess, where he came from, and we see that he's arrived at the farm that he wanted to get back to, and he runs out into the field, and he winds up collapsing, and Dahl sort of runs off to try and get help, and horses actually come and sort of seem to be nuzzling him or checking him out, and that's kind of how the movie ends. But I think that in this moment we're seeing the humanity, of this character. So the commissioner has just said, he has no human feeling, and here he is. He's doing something very human. He's trying to get back to his childhood. He's trying to, he definitely has human feeling. But I think that all the characters do, and see Chiavelli with his family and how he cares about his family, and Gus with his kindness and his generosity, and even his hurt feelings. When the wife kind of says something nasty to him about being a hunchback, and he kind of says, hey, that's just the way I was born, or whatever he says, and you can kind of see he's definitely human, and Doc, again, as the gentleman bandit who always seems to be the voice of reason. So yeah, I found that very interesting, that it is summed up with this kind of, he's a hardened killer with no human feeling, but then we kind of get this one more scene where we kind of see that he does have human feeling. At least that's the way I see it. So what do you think about all this?
Yeah, I thought everything wrapped up pretty much how it should, based on how everything was set up. Lewis, the family guy, he died. His family is mourning for him. Again, with these type of movies where it's just like it's this journey or mission or quest film, and these characters think the goal is to get this money or the drugs or the jewels, and that's going to make their life better. And in reality, they just need to look inward, and they have everything they need. They just don't see it. And it's just like Lewis, he had a wife and a kid. He didn't need to do this. He could have just, if he would have stayed on the straight and narrow, he would have been fine. Gus, heart of gold, but he cared for the wrong people. He made bad decisions, and his kindness ended up getting him where he is. Trapped in a hole. Even you could say that about all these characters. All of their end came from their own flaws. Even with Dix, he just wanted to be with the horses. In the end, if he would have just went out there, he didn't have to commit anything because he didn't get any of the money anyway. The little bit of money he got, he gave back some to Doc. So it's like, Dahl, she should have just said how she felt. Maybe that would have changed things. But you just see all the flaws that were set up, all the things that the characters thought they needed that could have made their lives better if they would have done this caper. They should have just stayed away from it and just looked within themselves, and could have been a happier ending for all of them. With that said, two things I will note. I love the subtlety in the writing, in that a lot of things are up for your interpretation, and a lot of things that happen at the end were set up at the beginning. The one thing that I thought was not great writing, felt kind of tacked on, were two things. One is that whole cop thing. It's like my eyes were rolling when he was like flipping those switches. But I'm like, that's probably just a mandate by the Hays Code or something, or like, censorship. But God, were my eyes rolling when he was flipping those switches. What if there were no cops? It's like, come on, dude. Every time there's like a police shooting here in the States, there's always like people saying that, like, well, what if there were no cops? Yeah. But so that stuff annoyed me, but I think that's more of a mandate. And the other thing that I think wasn't necessary is Doc saying how long the cops were there. I thought the story told itself, and it was kind of implied that if he didn't watch the girl dance, then he would have gotten away. And even if you
Yeah.
couldn't figure that out with the setup at the beginning with him looking at the young girls, or with the cab driver saying, "Hey, we gotta go," and he just wants to look at the girl. That one shot, the one creative shot in the whole film, where the girl dances and then it zooms in on the diner glass, and you see the cops looking in. That shot told you all you needed to know. We didn't need the dialogue to spell it out for us. I thought that
Hmm.
scene could have just been left on the editing room floor. It shouldn't have even been written, because it spelled things out too much, just like the suicide thing. Like they didn't spell that out and it worked better. So
Hmm.
I just thought that and the cop, those were the only two writing things that I didn't like in the film. But aside from that, I thought everything was good down to the last shot. I thought was really good. A really tight, well told story, great writing, what you'd expect from John Huston. Very good John Huston film. I think it's hurt by the lack of creativity in the way that the film is shot. And I think it's also hurt by the fact that we've seen this story played out so many times. We don't know what it's like to be in 1950, haven't seen this film for the first time, so we don't truly know how impactful it should be. We can just assume, but we can't feel the impact, even though our mind tells us, like, oh, this is a really, really important film. Unless we feel it, it doesn't really connect with us. I think that's why it's not as high on his list of his films, but it's definitely quality wise, it's amazing.
Yeah, I agree, and I think what you said there about perhaps the Hayes Code is the reason why we needed some of this stuff about Lieutenant Dietrich being in jail and he's going to be prosecuted. I mean, in a way, it would have been more interesting if we just didn't hear about him. Like we know he's corrupt, and he turned on the guy and turned him in. But I think they kind of had to say that to satisfy the code, and perhaps even the other stuff about yeah, okay, there are some corrupt cops, but most of them are okay. And what if there were no cops? And I mean, my only question is he saying it's better to have bad cops than no cops? I mean, it kind of seems like that's what he's saying there, and I'm not sure that that's really something that should be said. But in any case, yeah, it was very interesting ending, and yeah, I really liked the movie. And like you, I feel that I saw it before, but so much of it was just brand new to me. So I'm not sure if I actually saw it before. Maybe I just saw part of it. I don't know, but definitely worth seeing, and I will be watching it again in the future. I think it's really good.